wherein under at least special conditions that I'll define, human intention can robustly affect physical reality. On the one hand, it's the chi pump for the meridian system, it's the prana pump for the chakra system. And that is what connects us on the one side to the higher dimensions, and on the other side, suppose we take a crystal, and within that crystal, we order the vacuum to be synergistic with that crystal. Now, you have a capability of doing something far beyond physical reality. So we have new magnetoelectric phenomena, and I think this is where ki, or chi, comes in, that it's really part of the energy structure of this domain, of reciprocal space domain. And this is a domain, I won't go into it, but what in the books, I talk in terms of an ordered nodal network structure, which diffracts these consciousness waves to make an imprint on this reciprocal space level, but also it really is time to change the physics paradigm. A lot of wonderful people have been working on things that science could not accept. There weren't the bridges. There wasn't a framework. And what I have been trying to do is to provide a framework. We're all potential avatars to do all the things that we used to call miracles.
We're looking for Dr. Tiller now to help us put all this together. As we go along, we'll try to, I'll take the liberty of acting sort of as a moderator, and maybe we can have all a freedom of expression. So let's all come into a spirit of reception, a spirit of learning, as we now have this honored scholar with us, Dr. Tiller.
Thank you, Rick. It was really nice to be with you folks today. And I see some familiar faces and some new faces. I greet you all. Today I'm going to talk about some little bit of the content of my new book with Walter Dibble and Michael Cohane, Conscious Acts of Creation, The Emergence of a New Physics. And basically the purpose of my talk is to convince you folks that we have plenty of critical experimental data wherein, under at least special conditions that I'll define, human intention can robustly affect physical reality. Without those conditions, human intention still affects physical reality, but not quite so robustly. And I want to show how this is relevant to you and your worldview. Because as you think of yourself and your world is how your intention is put to work. And then I'm going to break after this point and have some discussion, and then I'm going to go forward to try to provide you with a theoretical perspective as to how you can understand that. And as best as possible, I'm going to do it without mathematics.
Very good.
The agenda for the first part is this. Basically, Rick has already said something about the paradigms of physics. I'll say a little bit. Then I'll go into experimental design, talk about 3 initial target experiments, what the results were, and the conclusion of that is without a doubt that we've achieved the goal, basically to show that human intention robustly affects physical reality, first for an inanimate material, water, and then for an in vitro biological material, alkaline phosphatase, ALP, and then an in vivo living system, fruit fly. And it turns out that this great result depends upon something we didn't anticipate, that is, in the process of doing the experiments again and again, we conditioned the space. That is, space appeared to be malleable such that by our actions and intentions, we were able to raise the symmetry of that space. And there are certain signatures for that, and there are a whole variety of important consequences which relate to physics experiments, that relate to life. And I will talk about them. We'll see that there is within the human being, there is a pump that pumps chi and prana, and the implications of that. I'll give some examples of that in humanity and the implications for humanity, philosophy, science in general, and a whole variety of technologies. Bottom line is, it appears that one can influence in a better way every technology we presently have and create new ones. That's what it looks like from here. For the B part, basically, I won't go through this much, but basically I will show you how we have to shift our frame of reference for viewing the universe. And I want to go back to quantum mechanics. One of the leading beginning points was de Broglie's particle tidal wave concept. Where that takes us, once I make a couple of postulates, and then go to Dirac's work on the origin of the electron, see what that tells us, postulate a bit more, and show you the multidimensional model for a view of the universe that would allow human qualities of mind, consciousness, intention, emotion, and spirit to be formally introduced to a mathematical structure, which would be an expansion of quantum mechanics. So we would have a paradigm different than the one we presently have. The present paradigm, there is no place in the formal structure wherein any human qualities can enter. And as my Russian friend is fond of saying, friends, that is Bolshitsky. The paradigm thing is important in the sense that we have to always recognize that nature is richer than the models we use to describe it. The old paradigm was a theological one in which God moved everything at personal will, etc. And then along came Copernicus and Galileo and Newton and so many others who showed that God may still be moving it, but it's not personal. It's very impersonal, and doesn't mean personality can't be involved in that kind of contact, but it is a lawful set of structures that led to the paradigm called classical mechanics. And at the end of the 19th century, scientists were applauding each other, saying, we know it all now, all we have to do is cross a few T's, dot a few I's, and it's all made. Don't advise anyone to go into physics. And then the universe surprised them by opening the door on the quantum and on relativity concepts. And there was a very big struggle to shift to the paradigm. Many of the people went to their deathbed with the old paradigm, thinking the new stuff was terrible. But there were a lot of young folks who moved that frontier forward, and in 30 to 40 years there was a new paradigm which we called quantum mechanics. And during the rest of this past century, that was refined. We came to understand a lot about it. It became fairly reliable, remarkably reliable. In certain places it could be applied. And in the latter part of this just past century, again, scientists were applauding each other, and physicists were saying, we know it all now. We can write the theory of everything. And there are several books by that title. Now, in that paradigm, as I said, there is no place for any human qualities to influence the formal description of quantum mechanics. And yet for well over a century, there have been lots of experiments saying that humans can influence physical reality. Most scientists are more comfortable sweeping that under the rug, and they have been able to sweep it under the rug because in general the effect size is small. And they can say, well, we can just neglect it because it's probably random errors. What we have contributed in the recent time is to address this question head on about human qualities of consciousness, in particular intention, affecting physical reality. And we have fortunately been led to develop a technique wherein it is possible to objectify the intention by putting it into a simple electrical device. And that device we have called an IIED, Intention Imprinted Electrical Device. And we have applied that to 3 particular target experiments. Now what we do is we take 2 identical, simple electronic devices. They're really quite simple in modern terms. We take one, we wrap it in aluminum foil, we put it in an electrically grounded Faraday cage, and that is our control device. We take the other, we set it on a tabletop around which 4 highly inner self-managed individuals who are long-time meditators. They go into a deep meditative state. And we can go into the details later if you like, but at some point during that period, there is a cleansing of the environment to remove old imprints, and then one of the 4 speaks the specific intention for the target experiment. I'll show you what some of those are in a minute. And that is held for the order of 15 minutes. And then there is a subsidiary intention given to seal the prime directive into the device so that it doesn't leak away. And then that is set, and the individuals come out of meditation, check the device, feeling it, see if it feels right. If it doesn't, go back in and do it again. Never had to do it more than twice. And that device then, the imprinted device, is wrapped in aluminum foil and put in its own electrically grounded Faraday cage until we're ready for the next step. Turns out if we do not do this, shielding and putting them in a Faraday cage that's grounded, then they can be hundreds of meters apart and in the off state, and they still will somehow crosstalk so that you lose the control. The control becomes like the imprinted device. So we have found that when using that simple technique, we have been able to keep the imprints in the device for 4 to 6 months. So it means you can do a lot of experiments. The 3 target experiments we started with are listed here. The first was to look at water. One device could be to raise the pH of water by 1 full pH unit, no chemical additions, and we have a measurement accuracy of at least 1/100th of a pH unit or better. And so we're asking for a signature to be at least 100 times larger than our measurement accuracy. So we're not looking for something down amongst the noise. If you want to, we also did the companion experiment of lowering the pH. That's another device because that's another specific intention. We moved from the water experiments to expand into the biological realm, and we wanted to look at an enzyme, alkaline phosphatase, and so the imprint was to increase the thermodynamic activity of that liver enzyme. Right.
Very significant.
1 unit of pH is very significant in the sense that if you take a human, if you take 2 of them, up 1 and down 1 pH unit, if you go to those limits, all right, you're all dead. I mean, basically our life functions within 1 pH unit. At those boundaries, those extremes, we're in serious trouble. So a pH unit means a factor of 10 in hydrogen ion concentration. So again, the whole point is that this is a very big signature. All right, the third thing was then to move to looking at an in vivo system, a living system. Would the same procedures work for a living system? And so we worked with fruit fly larvae. And the idea being here, the intention was to increase the ATP to ADP ratio in developing fruit fly larvae so they would be more fit and therefore have a shorter larval development time. So those were the 3 target experiments.
Are these fruit flies living longer after you experiment with them?
The intention was only for the reduction in larval development time, and you'll see, Joe, that we can reduce it by up to 25%, which is pretty significant. So the stage from larva to adult fly can be reduced. In terms of what we did, we had to be very careful. You're talking about a living system, so you can't make the intention such that the living system sacrifices itself.
The reason we used the fruit fly is because there's a host of
Hold on a second.
work that's already been done.
There's a huge amount of work done on fruit flies, and that's why, and it turns out that Michael Cohane was an expert.
Did you attempt any EM frequencies greater than 9.3?
No. Basically, the simple device that we had, it was the total output power was less than a microwatt, and the frequencies, one was a single oscillator, another device was 3 oscillators, all of them within 1 to 10 megahertz. Okay.
You're staying in the Truman residence. You're staying right in the...
Well, it just turned out this was simple and was available. The thing is, I think there are many, many ways. I could take your shirt and imprint it with an intention.
I'm doing exactly
But
that.
you're doing exactly that right now, exactly.
I've got an Oregon box and I'm putting all my clothes in.
Well, then I'll take someone else's shirt. But the point is that this was convenient, and it worked well. I'd had prior experience with it, but the details are less important than the overview. Okay?
Are the flies healthier, though?
The flies don't necessarily live longer, and none of them have ever told me they were healthier, but they looked fairly fit.
Very happy, though. They're very happy.
They seem very happy, yes. They more quickly got to the place of producing more fruit flies. And so I suppose that's good. Anyway, this is just to give you an idea. Let's look at this one, because details are important. So the thing is, let me just read it. For the fruit fly experiment, to synergistically influence the availability of oxygen, protons, and adenine diphosphate, that is a precursor, and the activity of available concentration of NAD, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. That's a catalyst, energy catalyst, plus the activity of the available enzymes dehydrogenase and ATP synthase, which help break these things down and recombine them in the mitochondria, so that this production of ATP, adenine triphosphate, which is the energy storage molecule in all of our cells, in the fruit fly larva is significantly increased, as much as possible without harming the life function, okay, relative to that of the control sample. So that's the point. We wanted to have a big enough effect to show statistically that it was significant, but we didn't want to go beyond that because we didn't want to hurt the organism.
Do you think your mind was a factor in this, too, do you think your mind was overriding the experiment?
Just be patient, Joe.
Thank you.
All right. This is the simple setup for the water experiments. The bottle of water with the measurement pH electrode and a thermistor to measure temperature, all going out of the Faraday cage into a meter, which then goes to a computer to continuously record. And this represents the device being inside the Faraday cage with its going out to its power pack. And later on we'll see that we do an experiment which relates to distances between different stations, in this case the order of 115 to 156 feet, another one, D, down here, which is 900 feet away. So just remember that. Well, the first thing we noticed with the water, with the unimprinted device, was that, for example, on the 7th of July, we gave a 1-hour exposure, and then measured it on the 8th and the 10th and the 17th and the 18th, you see that these curves hop around and they're fairly rough. And if one has experience with measuring pH at short times, this in fact is the way they are. It really bounces all over the place. However, with the intention imprinted device, in this case it was the 5th of August, and the 1 hour treatment was given, and here we see basically that things moved in direct steps towards the equilibrium range, and they were smooth in terms of the curves. So the underlying theme is that the intention tended to cohere things. That's the point of that viewport. Here is the experimental result for 2 cases. Let's start with the bottom one, which is the delta pH, the increase up 1 pH unit, so an increase of pH. And here, this isn't what we started with, this was a second experiment, that was the first one. But basically it started at 6.1, it initially comes to a kind of local equilibrium with the measurement instrument, the electrode, and then it started climbing out of the equilibrium range over a 5-day period to exactly 1 pH unit higher. Here is a circumstance for the pH down. 2 experiments done. The interesting thing about these experiments was, again, they quickly get into the equilibrium range and come down, about a half a pH unit these. One experiment was where the device was on and you were measuring simultaneously. The second experiment was with the jar sealed and the device was on for 5 days, then take the device away and put it in its Faraday cage, then open the top of the jar and put in the measuring instruments and let it go for 5 days. And it followed the same track. Interesting. Not fully understandable, but interesting. Okay, that's the water work. Now let's move to the in vitro liver enzyme. The protocol in this case was to measure 4 things simultaneously. That is, we would have what we call a control. We can put it inside the Faraday cage. We can put it inside the Faraday cage with the unimprinted device for a certain time. We could put it inside the Faraday cage with the imprinted device for the same time. And we run all 4 of these simultaneously, just side by side, okay, in a control room. The procedure is to expose. We have them in the empty case, no enzyme in it, and this is water, for 2 days. And then we put the enzyme solution in and hold it here for 30 minutes. And then we analyze it. Okay? And we have 2 dilutions. With a treatment, we add some water to it. And forget the numbers, you can read them if you want. Basically, this one is the more concentrated one. This is the more dilute one. But what we see now, here is the reading for the control. It's just out in the room environment. You put it in the Faraday cage, and so all that's happening is that the high-frequency electromagnetics can no longer get to the system, and there's something, it's more fit by something like 15%, which is very significant and important for us in terms of the amount of electromagnetics in our environment and their effect upon processes in cells. And then if we take the unimprinted device, and it's putting out less than 1 microwatt in this frequency range 1 to 10 megahertz, and it's inside the Faraday cage, so the background's pretty much gone, and it brings it all the way back to here with the other dilution even down below. So that small amount of electrical energy had a significant effect upon the, let's say, the coherence of that enzyme. And basically then, so if we go to the IIED, it's outputting the same less than 1 microwatt, but it's got the imprint intention. So the imprint intention, so we go from here, and for this one, it would bring it down. Let's shift it over, okay, down to here, and then the imprint intentions brought it back up, brought it up above the other. So we see the effect of the imprint intention. And in this particular case, you can make these various comparisons, and you get all that wonderful information. Now for the fruit fly larva, again the same kind of protocol, 4 of them side by side, okay, at 18 degrees C and 55% humidity. And you can see that we studied something like 10,000 larvae and about 7,000 adults. We added some NAD, or we just used the pure water. NAD, as I said before, is a catalyst. And if we just look at the NAD one, then basically, again, here's the control for the ATP to ADP ratio. You put it inside the Faraday cage, and it's gone up about the order of 20% in terms of greater development of ATP. So it says that just the electromagnetic environment that we live in is sufficient to degrade the production of ATP in the cells by the order of 15 to 20% for the fruit fly larva. And then if we put in the unimprinted device with its small power output, it brings it down below the control, and in terms of the imprinted device with the same kind of power output, it's bringing it back higher up. So that we see again an effect. The statistics for the last experiment again was p-values are better than 0.001. The statistics for this are better than 0.001. The larval development time basically is just the inverse of this. So the shorter is the larval development time, the more fit they are. And so here we go from the control inside the Faraday cage, they're more fit. And then if we go to the unimprinted device, they're quite a bit less fit. And with the imprinted device, they're more fit. They're the order of the control for that particular experiment. So in essence then, that comes to the conclusion that I'd said earlier, that we have achieved the goal we initially set out to do. Okay, that we looked at an inanimate material, we looked at a biological in vitro material, we looked at a living biological system. And in all cases, we were able to show that the devices, and all you do is you just take the device and turn it on for a period of time, and you see the data goes in the direction of the imprint intention. Statistically, showing it's not a random effect, the statistics are better than 1 part in 1,000. Now comes the wonderful serendipitous surprise. We found, and this turns out to be a really crucial part of the experiment because it tells us what is needed to achieve those good results. We stumbled on the fact that as we continue to do these experiments, measurements seem to be changing, and we got the idea that the space, the very space itself, was being conditioned. We didn't know quite what the word condition meant, but we knew that something was happening as we continued to do the experiments. We have since found that if we just have a device set up just to condition a space, then this same sort of thing happens in about 3 months in the space. But what we found was that for the order of a month to 2 months, there's not much change. And then we start seeing a change, and then we get to a kind of plateau where we can take the device out at that point in time, and it stays there. We have spaces that have been conditioned and remain conditioned for well over a year and still going. So the first thing in our minds was, okay, how can we tell something about what this space is? There were some signatures, and I'll show you those in a minute. But the experiment we decided to do was a very simple one. The experiment was to just put a simple DC magnet, first with the North Pole up, underneath the jar of water that we were measuring. and after 3 or 4 days, turn it over and measure it with the south pole up. Now, it turns out in conventional reality, which is called a U1 gauge symmetry reality, in that case, the magnetic force is proportional to the square of the magnetic field. So you should never see a polarity effect. You know, it's just like -2 times -2 is the same as +2 times +2. All right? The sign goes out. And when we do that experiment in a normal space, an unconditioned space, we get no effect whatsoever. However, when we do it in a conditioned space, here's one of the pieces of data. So here we see, this is pH up here versus time, and over the order of 3 or 4 days, we see that with the south pole up, the pH just keeps increasing. And with the north pole up, if anything, it decreases a bit. And the stronger is the field, the bigger is the effect. This difference is the order of a half a pH unit. We've had measurements of 1.5 pH units, etc. So, yes.
Is the implication that there is an energy transfer from the magnet to the effect of the pH shift?
No. The implication is that the gauge symmetry of the space has changed. Something very fundamental has changed. And where is it? It's in the vacuum. And our supposition is that the vacuum, at the U1 gauge space state, the vacuum is random. So if you develop order, some measure of order in the vacuum, then you raise the gauge symmetry. But anyway, the effect is that it's a profound effect. It says that the very fabric, the space, is somehow malleable to this intention. And it changes the symmetry. And in this talk, I'll come to what that really means to us. In terms of signatures, what do you see? You always see if the intention is for the pH to go up, you see it go up. If the intention is for the pH to go down, it goes down. But when you get to a significant level of conditioning, you start to see not only sort of diurnal oscillations, this is temperature, this is pH, you see those large ones, but you see these small period oscillations, and these are fairly big magnitude oscillations. Now what they look like, if you just amplify them, they're not just random, they're very orderly, they are lawful. And any sense that you want to talk about it. And the way in which we determine characteristics of the lawfulness is we do a Fourier transform. And so here what you see for one of the oscillations in that picture is here's the fundamental, the first harmonic, second harmonic, third harmonic. It's a beautiful structure, okay? So that's a very lawful wave. So that's one characteristic, and it turns out that when you get to that place where the oscillations and temperature also oscillates, we get temperature oscillations which can be 3 or 4 degrees in the pH, and they both have the same period. Also, electrical conductivity has the same period, etc. You see all of these sorts of things, and if you take away the intention imprinted device, they still stay there. And this is the characteristic that after a year is still going on in the space that one of the spaces we created.
It's actually a memory.
It is a memory. You can speak of it as a memory, exactly. It's something about space remembers. Now, this is an experiment we did we had 4 different sites we were doing experiments. This is up in Minnesota. And the barn, this site, and these 2 sites were not conditioned, but this site was. And we were able to trigger oscillations in the barn using an IIED, and so this is the result we got. And with no IIED present in this office that was about 150 feet away, we see this highly correlated result picked up at 150 feet away. This one is 900 feet away. It is not conditioned. It does not show this high correlation. However, as we worked on this space with more and more experiments, it eventually became like this space. So we had correlations over the 900 feet. So it says that just like why we had to put things in the Faraday cage, it says there's a level of the universe where there can be communication not in the normal way, because in these experiments things were all in Faraday cages, electrically grounded Faraday cages. So the insights that we gain from that, then, certainly the prime directive for the specific intention was fulfilled over time. And there was a kind of intelligence because the one device didn't do what the other device was supposed to do, or what the other device was supposed to do. And it acted just like a thermodynamic potential on the material. I mean, just as if it was you're changing the pressure or you're changing the temperature. So something very fundamental about thermodynamics was going on here. There was an incubation period which was the order of several months, as I mentioned. And there had to be some kind of ingredient that was involved in this conditioning process. And as I said, what appears to happen is that when you have conditioning, you've altered the gauge symmetry, the basic symmetry of the space. Now, the place where these kinds of things are talked about is in the modeling of the Big Bang, and I'll come to that in a minute. And as I say, the oscillation property is a significant indicator, because you never get those oscillations in an unconditioned space. So here we're back to this again, and the issue is, it says then that any measurement is made of two parts. This U1 gauge part, or let's say a part, plus some other part which depends upon how much conditioning you have. And it turns out for the U1 gauge symmetry state, this part is much bigger than that. All right? So it says, but the effect of this is still there, a little bit of it, in that. We'll come to that again later. However, if it's strongly conditioned, then this part can be much bigger than that. So you can have a very different reality. I mean, really different in terms of the magnitude of the measurements, or the kind of measurements. Just as I say, the DC magnetic field polarity is that kind of change. So what it says to me is that if we look now at the thermodynamic free energy, okay, the very fundamental quantity in our universe, nature flows in such a way as to reduce the free energy. All of our life is based upon the thermodynamic potential driving forces and the kinetics of those transformations. And so it appears then with a degree of conditioning that you can go through a variety of symmetry states, starting from this U1 gauge and going past this SU2 gauge. And so what it says is if you somehow had a device and you could connect it, let's say between this SU2 and the U1, it could do useful work. It's a thermodynamic pump. All right? That's what thermodynamics is all about. And so you ask yourself the question, might there be some organ or function in our bodies that is at a higher gauge symmetry state when we're born? Because if it is, then that can pump what we call life. Everything about life. It would do all the work. It would make synapses go. It would have the brain function. It would just pump the heart, etc. Now that's interesting speculation. It turns out the answer is yes. There is such a thing. I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to say, when I have this on, the place where, if you do a lot of reading where you've seen this kind of thing before, is the Big Bang. The Big Bang was supposedly an explosion that took everything up into fundamental particles and beyond that. And then as the universe cooled, it went through very high states of from a very high state of symmetry to successively lower states of symmetry, eventually getting down to the SU2 gauge symmetry level and still going down, eventually getting to the U1 gauge symmetry level. And at that level, we had continued decreases of free energy associated with going from the plasma state to the gas state to the liquid state to the solid state. And then various kinds of orderings going on in the liquids and solids. All of that was reductions of free energy in the system. So the place where you see this SU2 gauge and the U1 gauge is in that kind of conversation about the Big Bang. So now it turns out that acupuncturists have for some time known that if you put a DC magnet at an acupuncture point, you get a different response whether it's the South Pole at the point or the North Pole. And if you do advanced kinesiology, the muscles, it's the proprioceptors in the muscles that connect to the acupuncture meridians, and that's an unconscious kind of communication system. If you put a DC magnet, you bring it up into the biofield adjacent to that muscle, if the North Pole is adjacent to the muscle will weaken. If the South Pole is adjacent to that muscle, the muscle will strengthen. You've got a DC polarity effect. Can't be U1 gauge. Has to be a higher gauge symmetry, just like our experiments. So it says to me that that system, the acupuncture meridian system and the chakra system connected with it, that in fact, in the new born embryo, the development of that is what starts the pump. And with the child born, that is the pump that pumps chi or ki, whichever terms you want to use. And so on the one hand, it's the chi pump for the meridian system, it's the prana pump for the chakra system. And that is what connects us on the one side to the higher dimensions, and on the other side to the coarse physical level of our bio-body suits. We know when a group of humans get together, committed, devoted, they meditate together, they pray together, then they create a field. And we've all had the experience, we've all sensed it, sometimes we haven't wanted to leave the group. But it raises the symmetry level from what's coming, they're pumping chi and prana. Now, if they leave the room, it's there, but it starts to decay. Okay? It's what we would call metastable. If they come the next day before it's fully decayed, and they do the same thing, and it pumps up a little higher. They do it the next day a little higher, and the next day a little higher, next week, next month, the next year. That's how we have created, or people have created, sacred spaces on our globe. We've all had those experiences of walking into those spaces.
That energy is transferable too, from one person to another.
That energy is definitely transferable. Qigong masters can transfer it over 1,000 miles. They can influence specific experiments over 1,000 miles. So the potential is there to do amazing things, and we all have it. The second example I would give you is the kind of thing that well-meaning, compassionate, loving people who do work in their own office, in essence, and they do it every day, they in fact have raised the gauge symmetry. They don't realize it. And we can go in with experimental equipment and we can see that the symmetry is raised by just measuring the pH.
This really makes a doctor. This makes a real doctor, doesn't it?
It makes a real doctor. The third example I want to give you is the inventor that's worked in his garage for several years. Let's say he's building a free energy device, one of those crazy things, okay, trying to get greater than 1 efficiency, greater than 100% efficiency. And he works on it dedicatedly for years, and he's successful. And so he calls his friends in, and he demonstrates it to his friends, and they're excited. They're so excited, they say, oh gosh, let's start a business. Oh, but before we do that, we have to have it independently tested by someone else in some other town. He didn't know that he had unintentionally, with his intention, partially conditioned that space. So the machinery, everything was part. It was saturated with whatever this stuff is. But he goes to this other space in another town. That's an unconditioned, that's a U1 gauge space. All he's going to get is U1 gauge physics, and that's what the guy finds. Happens all the time. We haven't recognized that the importance is to first condition the space and then do the experiments. Now, so what I'm saying is that in every act of your life, it's like this. Whether you're a spouse communicating with a spouse, or a parent with a child, one human to another human, a performer to an audience, or a practitioner in an office to a client, your system allows you to radiate the chi and the prana so that you pump the space and you can change the local gauge symmetry of the space and thus make significant effects here. And the thing you have to recognize, it isn't just here interaction, it's also the unseen universe deciding whether to help you or not. And in our case, I don't believe we could have imprinted those devices, got them, see, because those devices had to be at an SU2 gauge level. And I don't think we did it all by ourselves, we four meditators. And then if you have a device, we find, for example, if we take a computer out of our system that's been conditioned and giving these beautiful oscillations, the oscillations diminish or disappear for maybe a day, and then they come back. Because this device gets saturated with whatever the stuff is, and that's part of this oscillation. So always, all of these things are there in pretty much everything that you do. Okay? The point is that every measurement has two parts. Okay? The one part is there for this is a random vacuum state with the U1 gauge, and it turns out that's why the coupling substance, the amount that's available in that interaction, is very small. Okay, it comes from the human qualities. They're there, but you have to do good statistics to be able to show them. All right? All the parapsychological work is that kind of thing. There are superstars in that area as well, just like a Michael Jordan or a Tiger Woods in the physical domain. But in general, for most humans, the effect size is small. We're all potential avatars to do all the things that we used to call miracles. All right? Yes?
The superstars, as you say, couldn't that have implications that they carry the conditioned space with them?
Exactly. Well, we all carry it. It's a question, in terms of one's acupuncture meridian system and the coupling substance, what level were we born with and what level did we develop through the practices of our life? I mean, Qigong masters can do pretty amazing things. So the point is, a lot of it is inner self-management and practice. It's like another muscle, okay? So wonderful, complex, it's really the spirit that's doing it, okay? The mind is the first place for the imprint of intention from the level of spirit to manifest. George?
You consider the soul and the spirit to be very different.
They're quite different, yes. Yeah. I think of the soul to me is the spirit plus the mind domain plus the emotion domain. The only thing that is born and has died are the two outer layers of the bio-body suit, which I'll talk about in a minute, which is the direct space part and the reciprocal space part, the electric part and the magnetic. Electric monopole part, magnetic monopole part. So anyway, in terms of the implications for humanity, the first is that we do matter. We really do. All of this stuff is just for us. It's a great big teaching machine for us. So personal, sustained, specific intention influences substances in specific ways. And it influences people, and it influences events around us. The other one is, from our experiments, space is malleable. That is the symmetry. So it's possible for humans to collectively and individually raise the physics gauge symmetry of space. And this leads to an altered reality and can be quite different than the reality that we all cognitively perceive in a U1 gauge state. And that altered reality can be metastable if it hasn't gone far enough, or it can become stable if we can kick it up high enough. We have to nucleate the new phase. We have to nucleate elements of order in the vacuum in order for it to become stable. And that means we have to surmount a particular energy threshold. So the effects for general science, generally our present science, present quantum mechanics, is all U1 gauge. And human consciousness only has a small effect at that level. However, if we first condition the space to the higher symmetry state, that is approaching this SU2 state gauge, then the effect size can be very large. Then the effects that come from our intention can be very significant. I'm just almost finished with this part, Joe, and then we'll have general questions. Because of this, it really is time to change the physics paradigm. We see where the present paradigm is, and we see where it has to go. Okay? It doesn't hurt for physics. It just says, hey, expand the paradigm to allow for humans changing the gauge symmetry. That leads you to some vast new territories for research, investigation. Just a short list of things. Let me give you an example. In this case, for chemical or pharmaceutical industries, let's say you have a product line and it makes you $2 billion a year. The problem is you want to make a particular isomer and you get 3 of them, and the other 2 are the majority, and you have to get rid of them to high levels of purity. Suppose you can make a device which will tilt the equations so that the yield is very high of the one you want and minimal of those that you don't want. You make a little more than a couple of billion a year. It will influence all of these sorts of things, the basic aspect of coherence. So information processing systems will benefit greatly from this. Just for you, Joe, suppose we take a crystal and within that crystal we order the vacuum to be synergistic with that crystal. Now you have a capability of doing something far beyond physical reality. Okay? And this is the one that probably will take us to the stars as we really work with that.
Tell me the difference between vacuum and torsion.
Torsion, as the people use it, is described as a field, a higher dimensional field, like an electric field or a magnetic field, but it's a different field. It's a field that has tensorial qualities rather than a vector quality. Okay? But the vacuum is a vast medium, and we'll see it's even more vast than just this word. Okay, let's go on. Anyway, I think I should stop here because the application to anybody's offices, in a hospital, for nurseries, for problems with babies, to nourish life in those early days, to get them over the nucleation threshold into this world. The thing that's important is that there is a lot of work out there. A lot of wonderful people have been working on things that science could not accept. There weren't the bridges. There wasn't a framework. And what I have been trying to do is to provide a framework. It doesn't mean that all the details of all the things out there are correct. But a lot of it is correct. The question is how it is interpreted, how it is discussed, how it is described. One has to have a framework. It's like a picture, okay? And you can put things in relationship to other things in the picture. But if there's a big part of the picture missing, then it's very hard for most of humanity to connect the dots for some of these new technologies that you're talking about. That's the dilemma. In the last 50 years, the electromagnetic intensity of our environment has gone up 50 million times. So that's a big number.
Not necessarily beneficial.
Not necessarily all beneficial. Yes. So what this says is that for fruit flies, is that you can do that simple experiment and you see just putting it in a Faraday cage and screening out part of the environmental frequencies certainly doesn't screen out the very low frequencies, and it doesn't screen out the optical frequencies because we didn't wrap things in aluminum foil to do that. But it says just screening out that intermediate part, the effect for the fruit flies was the order of 15 to 20%. Yes?
Yep. Could you speak about the role of intention in healing and why healing works sometimes and other times that it doesn't?
In that picture that I gave with the unseen universe up there in a box, that's part of it. The other part is we humans, we go through cycles. Okay, we intend something to happen, and maybe a little later we thought, oh, how foolish of me, that I can't possibly do that. So the first time you write it, the second time you unwrite it, you erase it. And so the reason I didn't use humans in these experiments was because time average, their intention is not very strong because they erase a lot. It fluctuates and they erase. And there are a whole variety of things that go into all of that. So if you put it into a device, it's easier because the device doesn't have those cycles per se. It has different kinds of cycles. But somewhere in that category is why. And a lot of people think they're intending something and they're not really burning on it, or they're not as deeply committed, not as deeply devoted, etc. Human intention probably is the closest thing that it comes to. Probably is it's an act of creation, and therefore it is in the band of love. And we know practically nothing about love, but it begets consciousness. Okay, and then consciousness in turn converts to energies, and energies connect with mass. So let me move forward. Basically, the frame of reference for quantum mechanics is our familiar four space of distance time. Right? And that is okay so long as there are no mathematical singularities in the domain. However, quantum mechanics has lots of singularities, and relativity theory has a very big one at the velocity of light. So when there are singularities, then any mathematical function requires that one use what's called a Lorentz expansion rather than a Taylor's expansion. These were men who worked this out a century ago. What that says then, when you work with Lorentz expansion, you can put it in the form that I would call a biconformal base space. And it consists of two four-dimensional subspaces. And one of these is this distance time, and the other one is its reciprocal, 1 over distance and 1 over time. So 1 over distance is number per unit distance. That's a frequency. It's a spatial frequency. 1 over time is number per unit time. That's a temporal frequency. So in essence, then I call these direct space or D space with this symbol, and the other is reciprocal space or R space, and it's really this symbol system, K. So that a biconformal base space then is that when you have mathematical singularities, what you have to use, so it is these two subspaces. And if there are no mathematical singularities, then this part becomes 0 and it's just that. So it's always better to work from this. And the point is, this is where particles are, this is where waves are. So here we have the dual aspects of particle and wave, which is key for quantum mechanics. This part is local, that part's non-local. That's also a part of quantum mechanics. So, and this R space, I'm saying, is at the coarsest level of the vacuum. Now, we all think that we see waves, water waves and so on. But those waves are only modulations of particle density, that is, particle concentrations. If you have light flowing and such, and it's modulated, you see intensity go up and down, that in fact is just the modulation of the flux of photons. So if you think about it, and I invite you to try to think about it, try to think about any of your experience in this cognitive realm that is other than a modulation of particle concentration or particle flux. I think you will find you cannot find one. The pictures of waves in textbooks are continuum pictures, electromagnetism and so on. Those are in the vacuum. Now it turns out for this particular kind of dual subspaces, mathematics requires, underlined, that any substance quality in this space, in D space, has an equilibrium conjugate quality in this space, which is given by the mathematical Fourier transform. It is a mathematical relationship connecting these two qualities, and it goes, if you know the information pattern at this level, you can calculate the equilibrium value at this level. If you know it at this level, you can calculate the equilibrium value at this level. So that's a real step forward. Says that when we have this biconformal base space, we can know something about this space, even though we can't cognitively access it at our present level of development. Okay. And so it says then that any measurement has two parts, one which comes from D space and one which comes from R space. And as I said, under the U1 gauge condition, this part is very small. And you have to use statistical measurements to even begin to discriminate it. But if you have a conditioned space, this part is large. Easy to discriminate, and it makes a different reality. So when we talk about the physical world in the future, we need to talk about two layers, the coarse layer and the fine layer. Okay? Both aspects are very important to us. Let's talk about de Broglie. De Broglie's particle pilot wave concept was a very important one for quantum mechanics. This is one of the cornerstones, and what this looks like is it looks like this. That is, you have reciprocal space waves coming in as this particle is moving along, and it has an envelope around it. The envelope is called the de Broglie pilot wave, and the waves that come into it come from reciprocal space, and there are waves going out of it as it moves along. And if you do calculations of the relativistic quantum mechanical kind, then what you find is that the product of the two velocities, this reciprocal space wave, times the velocity of the particle, is c squared, the velocity of light squared. Now, from relativity theory, we know that the velocity of the particle is always less than c, the velocity of light. So it says that VW must always be greater than the velocity of c. All right? And people were concerned about that because of relativity and such, so they said, oh, it's not a problem. We'll just call it an information wave. So it's an information wave, and since it doesn't have mass, you don't need to worry about it. Okay? Now, I want to make my first postulate. Suppose that the particles that write these waves are the magnetic monopoles moving at velocities much larger than the velocity of light. And these R-space waves then act as polarization traces in the vacuum. Okay? And then it's a group of these then which form this pilot wave around the particle. And it turns out that one of the characteristics of this pilot wave, part of it, is like a vortex. You were asking about a vortex. In 3 dimensions, this first part, it's really this way, and that part is that way. And the point is that those compared give an aspect like spin, which would make the particle appear to be spinning if that's all you're focusing on. And so that would be where spin comes from. that's where magnetic dipole effects come from, as an image. So now we have conventional electromagnetism, and in this U1 gauge state we have electric monopole stuff, and we have magnetic dipoles, which I say are magnetic dipole images, but there's an interaction between them giving rise to Maxwell equations, okay? And that's real. We have all kinds of technology based upon it. But if, in fact, then these dipole images are related to the magnetic monopoles in the vacuum moving much faster than the velocity of light, then you have a potential problem with relativity theory. And now I make the second postulate. Second postulate is then, in order to get around that problem, let's suppose that there exists a higher dimensional substance, so it's not constrained by relativity theory. And so it can travel, parts of it can travel slower than light and interact with physical matter, coarse particulate matter, and parts of it can go faster than light, and it could interact with magnetic monopole substance, and it could exchange energy within its own envelope. I have called this substance deltrons from the domain of emotion. So we're now introducing a higher dimensional substance, 9-dimensional. These two subspaces, one is 4 and the other one's 4, so it's a special system. This biconformal base space is an 8-dimensional space. It's a special parameterization within that general group of 8-dimensional things. So now what this leads to are a number of things. I'll come back to that. So in essence, what I'm saying is that we have, looking at energy versus velocity, we have the normal physical branch going up to the velocity, to infinity at the velocity of light. And we have a kind of reciprocal mirror of this magnetic monopole branch of negative energy states with velocities greater than the velocity of light. Now the superluminal branch here at positive energies, they're imaginary particles, they're called tachyons. We haven't labeled these yet. Let's see, where am I? That goes there. And so what it says from this mirror, it's a kind of reciprocal mirror. There's a lot of things that can be said about it, but I don't have time. So here in the D space part, we have electric monopoles. Through the mirror will give electric dipole images. Here we have magnetic monopoles in R space giving magnetic dipole images. This leads to Maxwell equations. In this case, conventional electrodynamics, quantum mechanics, U1 gauge physics. In this case, this is a higher dimensional aspect, so that there is another equation set for magnetoelectrism, because it's driven by magnetic monopoles. The mathematics is called non-abelian, so it gets very complex. So we have new magnetoelectric phenomena, and I think this is where Qi, or Chi, comes in, that it's really part of the energy structure of this domain, of reciprocal space domain. And so in that family are all these things that Reich talked about, and people who talk about prana and such, and with all these words. So here's just another aspect of the mirror principle, and it is that, so we've got electric monopoles, magnetic monopoles. This one's where allopathic medicine is involved. This is where homeopathic medicine is involved. This is positive mass, that's negative mass. Velocity is less than light, velocity is greater than light. Positive energy states, negative energy states. Come down here to gravitation, levitation, etc. So that the characteristics of these two things, depending upon which is dominant, you can have both. So it says that where U1 gauge state is, then clearly gravitation is very dominant. But if you really get to high levels of symmetry in the reciprocal space aspect, then I would suggest that levitation is dominant. So that as we think and work towards technologies of these sorts of things in the future, then we're going to, I think, discover a lot about these sorts of things. Oh, the other thing, the last thing I wanted to mention, I'm going to mention it in passing because I haven't given you any mathematics, but it turns out that this deltron is really important because that's the coupler between the two substances. And that's the thing that grows with conditioning. All right? And that's the thing that intention acts on. So you can begin to see it becomes the bridge to the higher dimensional realm. And it turns out that empowers the Fourier transform. It makes the magnitude much larger and it also makes it more complex. So I'm having struggles with it. But it's a very important part of this picture. And it says that emotion is very important in manifesting physical reality. That is, you give things lots of oomph. People that don't give things oomph don't make much of an imprint. Okay? Joe, you give it lots of oomph. Okay, let's go to the next concept, which is...
You're talking about the power of the deep kiss? Is that what
You're wonderful. If I can think that up when I'm his age, man, my wife will be very happy.
You made half the island of Hawaii happy.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say that, but I observed. All right, we'll talk about Dirac for a minute. Dirac was a great theorist of the 20s, and he asked himself the question, where does the electron come from? He thought long and hard, and he came up with a resolution. And his resolution was something that relates to this picture. He says, suppose the vacuum is a sea of negative energy states and they're all filled. Then if a photon of sufficient energy comes along and is absorbed in the vacuum at some place, it can pop out an electron, okay, cross this band gap to some higher energy state, and leave behind a hole in the vacuum. And
Nowhere comes from actually nowhere.
what we think of as nowhere, but it's not nowhere, boy, it's really somewhere. And so the point is, if it's a hole in a negative energy state, or a negative energy structure, then it's minus a negative energy, so it's a positive energy, which means it's measurable. We can only measure positive energies. In terms of the charge, it's minus an electron charge, which is negative. It's a positive charge. This was the first piece of antimatter, became the positron. We have found, for every particle we've discovered in physics, the antiparticle. And they're all this way. They all come out of the vacuum, per se. So the vacuum, the thing that's important, is the stuff that was there that interacted with this photon. Now, there are several things that are important about this that people tend not to think about enough. One is that the energy level of this ground state energy here, of let's say the electron, is due to its interaction with this stuff. Which means that if, and I made this proposal about 10 years ago, suppose human consciousness could interact with the stuff of the vacuum and somehow shift its coherence a little bit. If it could do that, it means that this energy level, the ground state energy level, will change in magnitude. And if you can do it for one particle, you can do it for all particles, which means you can influence chemical reactions in terms of their rates of change and going right versus left, and you can do it for nuclear reactions. For quantum mechanics, for present quantum mechanics and relativity theory to be internally self-consistent, and that's what physics tries to do, become internally self-consistent. In order for that to happen, the prediction is that this stuff, this vacuum, has to contain a latent energy density of 10 to the 94 grams equivalent per cc, where each gram is related to energy by E equals mc squared. Now, that's a very big number, but what does it mean? What it means is that if you take the volume of a single hydrogen atom, a hydrogen atom is 1/10,000,000th of a centimeter across. Okay? You take that volume, you multiply it by 10 to the 94, and if you can say that the universe is essentially flat, that means you can neglect the gravitational constant, then what that says is that within that volume of that single hydrogen atom is 1 trillion times more energy than all the energy in all of the mass of all of the planets and all of the stars out to 20 billion light years. So on the one side you have the volume of a hydrogen atom multiplied by 10 to the 94. On the other side you have the sphere of 20 billion light years radius, and you multiply it by the average matter density in the universe that comes out of texts on astronomy. And the one side is bigger than the other by a factor of 1 trillion. So the point is that number approximation requires that it be a flat universe, as I say. But it's a huge consideration. It says there is stuff there. Okay, that stuff is huge. It's immense. So here's my third postulate, which I say then, suppose that human consciousness from the mind level, of course, which is 10-dimensional in my modeling, can interact with the stuff of the physical vacuum to change its degree of coherence. So that's what I said a little while ago. So now it turns out then we know from our experiments that we've done with the intention imprinted devices that if to have the effects we have got to be able to change the equilibrium constants of the water dissociation reaction or the CO2 solubility reaction, or both. Okay, those things are required. So here, this is the way that they can happen, by changing this ground state level by consciousness. So I now come to the fourth postulate. So suppose we're all spirits, okay? And in my modeling that's 11 dimensions or above, and we're having a physical experience as we ride the river of life together, and that we interact with physical reality via our intentions. Let me give you the bio-bodysuit model very briefly to see what this means. We're all this, let's suppose, and that our spiritual parents put us in this playpen called a universe in order to grow in coherence, in order to develop our gifts of intentionality, and in order to become what we were intended to become, which is co-creators with our spiritual parents. Now these bio-bodysuits made for us come in a wide variety of colors, 2 basic forms that we choose to call genders, and they have 4 main layers. The outermost layer is the electric monopole substance layer. The first inner layer is the magnetic monopole substance layer. The second inner layer is the emotion domain substance layer. And the third inner layer is the mind domain substance layer. So it's kind of like a diving bell, okay? Well designed to respond to this queer earth environment we're in, and to have mobility, and in that bio-bodysuit is a portion of our spirit self. Not all of it, just a portion. And the amount that can be there depends upon what kind of infrastructure is built into these layers. And we generally build infrastructure into these layers via the process of living and doing things. And the more infrastructure that is there, the more of our high spirit self that can come into this vehicle, and the more conscious we become. Consciousness to me is a concomitant or byproduct of spirit entering dense matter. So that as we build more and more infrastructure, more and more spirit enters, we become more conscious, we see more opportunities, we see a larger perspective, we understand ourselves and our others better, we begin to see that others are just part of ourselves, we begin to see that as we build others, we build ourselves. Okay? So it's a bootstrap process of becoming.
Doctor, what do you mean by build more infrastructure?
When you go to the gym to work out, you're building finer tuned muscles. When you learn to dancing, you learn rhythms and movements and patterns. There are infrastructures built into your body to allow you to do that automatically. That's what I mean. And I mean that at the outermost level, first inner level, second inner level, third inner level, love relationships very much related in the emotion domain level, learning about these things, going to school on the mind domain level, you build structures. So that's what I mean. Looked at another way, then, this is a picture of the bio-body suit as I would see it then. Here are these two subspaces, the four spaces, the whole thing being this 8-dimensional biconformal base space inside of the emotion domain, inside of the mind domain. And all of this I think of as a construct that is like a big teaching machine, teaching this to grow and become an effective co-creator. And so our body functions, we have this path through the outer layer of the bio-body suit to magnetic vector potential, which connects to these higher dimensional domains of emotion, mind, and spirit. Or we go through the reciprocal space level in the magnetic part of the layer of the bio-body suit, again to magnetic vector potential and then the connection. So allopathic and homeopathy are part of the larger whole. If we look at it in terms of an energy kind of construct, and it relates to the gentleman in the yellow shirt in the back, that basically here is the spirit domain and an energy structure. Then we have these positive energy states, a forbidden gap. Here is the reciprocal space, the magnetic monopole substance level. I'm presuming that then there are two more levels down here in this negative domain, but that's an arbitrary zero. As we evolve a little further, we'll just bring it down here, you see. But it's useful. It has been useful because all we've been paying attention to is this. Classical mechanics is all this stuff. Quantum mechanics is this stuff. And the stuff we're moving towards is all of this stuff. So how do intentions, or how do I think intentions work? In the modeling, then, the intention is an act of creation from the level of spirit. And you're doing this all the time in order to even move around this room. It basically imprints on the mind domain of the universe, and that is a consciousness, becomes a consciousness imprint. And this is a domain, I won't go into it, but what in the books I talk in terms of an ordered nodal network structure, which diffracts these consciousness waves to make an imprint on this reciprocal space level, but also activates emotions, and in particular deltrons, to increase the deltron activation. And this acts something like a toner in a Xerox machine. This imprint with that toner puts an imprint on the outer layer of the bio-body suit, and we've got all kinds of structures then which lead that towards materialization of our intention in physical reality. So that is the picture, is how I see it, that in essence we are intending all the time, all the things that we're doing. There are conscious intentions, there are some unconscious intentions as well. So this kind of a process, not yet proven, but it's consistent with the kind of experiments that we have done. That is, that intention, however the final modeling works out, we know that intention causes these, works its way all the way down to the physical chemistry at this level to produce changes, whether it's an inanimate system, whether it's a biological material, or whether it's a living system. And that's let me see how we are doing here. I think that's got to be it for the talk. We can have a few questions if you like. Master Rick? Yes.
I was wondering if you would comment about the role of, in terms of sacred space and the way that ritual in the various religious traditions has been a way of focusing intention to condition space that way.
Well, I think, you see, ritual is important so long as it is not just form. So long as one truly gets into the evoked pattern, to get into the ritual and really mean it, then you are broadcasting prana and chi. I think that's crucial.
It's the spirit of the ritual,
it's
not so much the form.
Right. It truly is the spirit of the ritual, and if the form helps you in terms of to get to it, then that's great. But if you don't get to the spirit of the ritual and don't really entrain with the spirit of the ritual, then you don't pump the system much. Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about the sacred geometry of the octahedron, working with that with intention, and the Merkaba, and how that interfaces with your bioconformal?
Well, I can tell you. Let's see. I brought some stuff, and I'll just. What am I going to show you? I think I won't do the octahedron per se, but let me. In the first book, I deal with this a lot, and in the second book, even more. For example, if I look at structures, in this case, let's just say a slit, or a solid, and then two, and then a square slit, circular slit, a triangular slit, Star of David slit. The Fourier transform, which is the reciprocal space part, its modulus is the amplitude of that. And for the single one, what you see are a series of wave oscillations which look like this. This is normalized, and it should turn it this way because goes up and down, going this way. And the longer this becomes, then the narrower become these undulations. And that's the mirror principle operating. Bigger things are in direct space, the smaller they are in reciprocal space. Now, when you put two of them together, then what you see is that this pattern for this one interferes with this pattern for this one, okay, in space. And so that's the interference now of two objects. You only see that in reciprocal space. Here they look to be separate. We look to be separate in direct space because our neural system is based on contrast, which is differences. In reciprocal space, it's the mirror principle. We are all connected. We are all entangled with each other. We are all interference effects with each other. Okay? So now let me come down through this. I mean, they're all patterns are similar, but this one, the triangle, here you see the amplitudes go down to zero as you go to higher and higher frequencies. Not so with the triangle. Same thing with the tetrahedron. Okay? And so you see wonderful things, but now when you see the interference comes from two parallel sides. Now it takes it down to zero. So all of these geometrical effects, you can calculate these things for any geometry. I have not calculated for the dodecahedron or various kinds of things. I've calculated for these simple ones, and they're straightforward to do. As long as you've got a big enough computer, storage, you can do it. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and again, let's get a standing ovation.
It was a pleasure.